Hello and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm David Ignatius, a columnist for the Post. Today I'm pleased to be joined by two journalism colleagues who are authors of a fantastic new book, Among the Braves. Shibani Mahtani, an international investigative correspondent for the Washington Post, and Timothy McLaughlin, a contributing writer for The Atlantic. Shibani, Timothy, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks. Happy to be here.
So I want to start with something that's in the news, which is the trial of 47 Hong Kong democracy activists that's nearing completion in Hong Kong. They were charged under with conspiracy to commit subversion under the 2020 national security law that's central to the story that you're going to tell us about. Um, you must know some of the people among these 47. Maybe you could begin by explaining the background of their case, telling us what happened in 2020, and then what the implications will be if the government wins this case in terms of any remaining shred of rule of law in Hong Kong.
Sure. Yes, I mean, the 47 activists have basically cover the whole swath of Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement. Everybody from sort of the most prominent activists that, everybody would have heard of, like Joshua Wong, to people like Claudia Mo, who were like long-term lawmakers in Hong Kong for many, many years, to people who were sort of newcomers on the political scene. And basically, they were all swept up in the beginning of 2021 for essentially participating in or organizing a very informal referendum for the pro-democracy movement. They were running an election primary, and they were then, when the national security law passed, they were swept up for subversion. Essentially, the government said that they were all conspiring to overthrow the government by running essentially this non-official primary. One of the people who's pled not guilty is actually one of the main characters in our book, Gwyneth Ho. She was a journalist who then essentially crossed the aisle and ran for politics and ran in that primary.
Timothy, if these people are convicted, what's the reaction of Hong Kong people likely to be? I'm curious about the mood in the streets. This is a place where people demonstrated by the tens of thousands just a few years ago. Is any of that left?
Yeah, so I mean, the timeline, we should, I think, know the newest reports today that this could be the final arguments could be finished in this case as soon as Monday. This has gone on for a very long time, and I think it's important for people to know that most of the people involved in this case have been denied bail. So they've been in jail the entire time since 2021, as this trial kind of drags on and on and on. It'll be 3 to 4 months probably from Monday, when a verdict does come down. In terms of kind of what the reaction could be, you know, hard to say with Hong Kong, but I think it's safe now to say that their reaction will be very muted because there isn't the space for any sort of protest, any type of dissent, any type of alternative voice to the government is so constricted, almost non-existent at this point. So it's very hard to say. It's very hard to see, rather, a situation where there would be a widespread showing of discontent with these verdicts, even if people do disagree with them.
Boy, that's a striking example of how far things have come. So let's pull back the camera a bit. As we saw in the introductory video before we began our conversation, uh, since 1997, the end of British rule, Hong Kong and China operated under what was called one country, two systems. That phrase was repeated so often. Shibani, explain to our viewers how that understanding worked in practice and when it began to become fragile and begin to break.
Yeah, so the really interesting thing here is that one country, two systems was designed by Deng Xiaoping not just as a solution to Hong Kong, or not just as like a kind of model for how Hong Kong could be reintegrated back to Chinese rule, but also for Taiwan. I mean, in the long term, China envisioned reunifying all of its territories on the periphery, or that they obviously didn't control, like Taiwan, through that one country, two systems formulation, where essentially they would be under Chinese rule, but get to keep their own autonomous courts, media, the banking system, currency, all of that. And so, this was something that was essentially, negotiated obviously by the British and the Chinese in the 1980s, was sort of handed down to Hong Kong people without much input for them at all, right? They didn't have a direct say in those negotiations. It was sort of sold to them as something that was, good for them, or something that was good for the world. We were in the middle of the Cold War then, obviously, it was seen as this kind of like cushion, right, between two very hostile oppositional systems. But really, I think, from our research in our book, the first real turning point there, the first real breach of trust was the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. I think that was when Hong Kong people really woke up to this sort of regime that could be possible, right? And what they could be facing if they were to be handed over, or when they were to be handed over, rather, to mainland China's rule. So I think that was when we saw the first kind of like awakening, and really the foundations of what then became the modern pro-democracy movement. But when we got to 1997, it seemed for the first few years that things sort of went as normal, and things didn't change overnight. But then essentially what we tried to do in our book is track that kind of like slow cut by cut by cut, and this sort of two like oppositional forces where every time Beijing would try to impose something, Hong Kong would try to fight back, and then it all sort of climaxes and culminates in 2019.
So, Timothy, let's talk about 2019. A key event in your book, and certainly in our memory, was the extradition law that Hong Kong sought to impose, that would have made it possible, in effect, to deport people to China, and would have, again, in effect, applied more of China's uh, uh, laws and restrictions to Hong Kong people. Just take us back to that time and the fallout among Hong Kongers to the extradition law.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it starts even a little bit before the law itself was imposed. The previous year before, in 2019, before the year before 2019, when the law was proposed, there's a really horrific murder that took place in Taiwan. A young couple from Hong Kong had traveled there for a Valentine's Day trip. The boyfriend murdered his girlfriend, disposed of her body, flew back to Hong Kong, and was actually arrested originally for using her credit cards to withdraw money from her banking accounts. He later confessed to the crime, but then they faced this dilemma where there was no extradition treaty with Taiwan, so he couldn't be sent back to face charges, and he also was kind of stuck in Hong Kong where he hadn't committed the murder crime. His only crime was withdrawing funds from his girlfriend's, now deceased girlfriend's account. So, elements of the government, I think, saw that as an opportunity, and they seized on that very horrific crime, and a mother who was grieving in public, to try to craft this bill which would allow extraditions to places that didn't have treaties with Hong Kong, including, mainland China. And so at first, early on, I think there was a little bit of kind of people worried about this, but I think you really started seeing it building in the spring, April, May, and then into June, when you had this mass protest that took place in early June, with estimates of 1 million people coming out to the streets. So it really built for a while, kind of quietly, and then sort of exploded. It was kind of nothing to everything, I think, in a way. And then we saw that carry on, through the summer, those huge protests.
So, Timothy, just to follow up, the Hong Kong chief executive at the time, Carrie Lam, seemed to be surprised by the level of public protest, as if she hadn't realized that she was lighting a firecracker. Is that right? Do you think she was taken aback by the public reaction to the
Yeah,
launch?
I mean, she is absolutely, had admitted as much in the wake of this whole thing. She gave an interview where she talked about how the government, while she was still in office, she gave an interview talking about how the government had been monitoring sort of the protest movement in Hong Kong since the 2014 Umbrella Movement. They saw that many people weren't coming out to protest. They saw that the pro-democracy movement was kind of at a lull. So she definitely didn't think that there would be this kind of, discontent. And I don't think the officials and government in Beijing expected it to be so explosive either. And then what started out as kind of a one issue protest really snowballed because of the government and particularly Carrie Lam's mishandling of it and the continued missing of off ramps, de-escalation moments for de-escalation that she kind of continued to plow by as she pushed on and on and on with this thing, despite the a huge portion of Hong Kongers coming out saying they didn't want anything to do with it.
And just to close out this question, I've always wondered whether de-escalation in this crisis was possible. It had a catastrophic ending, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But if wiser decisions had been made by Carrie Lam and others, could this confrontation have been averted, postponed for some years? Obviously, China's interest and control in Hong Kong is a long-going issue, but could it have been deferred?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think early on, you did see a huge swath of society coming out and saying like, this is not needed. You should stop this. It wasn't, it was Hong Kong people across, age and socioeconomic demographics. It was diplomats. It was business leaders. It was religious leaders. So there was, ample warning, given to Carrie Lam after the protest started and the lead up to the first kind of massive protest. And she continued to carry on and carry on and carry on with this. And I think simply, shelving it, declaring it dead very early on, would have diffused a large portion of the movement. And then, as we moved on from there, look, investigating the police, conduct, still kind of early on in the protest movement, I think would have, made a lot of people happy and kind of, given them something to, a bit of a victory there. So yeah, absolutely. There was, time after time, there was chances for the government to kind of, to back off this and do something differently, and they missed all those opportunities.
So let's talk about how you tell your story in this wonderful book. You see it through the eyes of four activists, Reverend Chu, Tommy, Finn, and Gwyneth, I think are their names. Shibani, just explain to our viewers, who are they? How did you find them? And why did you choose them to tell this larger story?
Yeah, so as mentioned before, I think, we really wanted to kind of take readers into like kind of the history of Hong Kong and its pro-democracy movement and have people understand like, okay, you saw this big, huge, major news event in 2019, all these people on the streets, but like, let's try to kind of understand how we got here. And we really wanted to tell that through the eyes of Hong Kong people and their lived experiences to kind of draw people in that way, and also to kind of center them in a story about their, their home, really. So Reverend Chu is the oldest in our book. He's over 80, and he got involved in the pro-democracy movement through 1989 and through the Tiananmen Square sort of uprising and then subsequent crackdown, right? And he was one of many Hong Kongers who went to Beijing to support the students there. He was very involved in the church and a pastor then. So that was his kind of entry point to, connecting his sort of spirituality and the sort of quest or drive for democracy. He ends up being essentially tapped to help fleeing dissidents from China in the wake of the Tiananmen Square crackdown get to Hong Kong and then to third-party countries through this operation called Operation Yellowbird. And that was really like one of the first moments the Hong Kong movement kind of came together in a way they really couldn't expect that they could have ever done, and pulled off this really incredible thing. So he kind of starts off our narrative and our journey. He's also very, famous for his role in the 2014 Occupy Central, and then, became later known as the Umbrella Movement. That was essentially, I think, sort of a first awakening, right, for young Hong Kong people, where they really, started to kind of find their voice, started to kind of coalesce, and really form the networks that allowed them to kind of, mobilize against the government in that year, and then even in 2019. But then obviously, with 2019 being such a big focus, we wanted to have three kind of young people to kind of explain like how and why people got so emotionally invested, how people got radicalized. So Tommy was a young man who was just a student. He was pretty apolitical, and through the movement, you see him go from essentially like somebody who was, just pelting eggs, to someone who learns to, make a Molotov cocktail, to someone who eventually flees Hong Kong by boat to Taiwan, because he, fears a very lengthy imprisonment there, and then eventually gets asylum in the U.S. So his life has obviously been completely altered by this movement. Fin Lau was in London when the protests broke out. He was one of the online activists who really sort of drove the movement behind the scenes. So drove it through online forums, Telegram groups, and these were very, very influential. And we really wanted him to kind of speak to that idea, right, that like online activism was really pushing so much of what we saw on the ground, even pushing so much of what we saw ending up in Washington and London with the imposition of sanctions. A lot of that came from very like motivated activists who are operating behind, anonymity. And then lastly, Gwyneth Ho, as I mentioned before, she's one of the 47 who are on trial for subversion, but she started off all this as a journalist, and covered it from the perspective of a journalist, and then through that sort of gets caught up in some of the movement's biggest moments, and then chooses to kind of use that energy and run for office, and kind of make something more of that, ends up in jail. We really wanted to use this idea of exile versus jail, and the two parts there.
You mentioned, Shibani, the need for anonymity, and I was struck in a note early in the book. You say that everyone who helped you, down to the fact checkers, requested complete anonymity. That suggests the degree of danger that people feel in being seen to be participating in anything that supports the democratic idea. Just give us a sense of what Hong Kongers who helped you feel about the situation they're living in.
Right. Yeah, I think, David, that's such a good point, because, essentially what we're seeing now in Hong Kong is that the red lines are so unclear. They just keep moving. They're, amorphous, and they're just not even formed yet, right? As we noted in the beginning, this trial where people were arrested in the beginning of 2021 is still, dragging out today. We're in December almost of 2023. So I think people just don't know what to expect from this law. They don't know what to expect from this new Hong Kong. Just yesterday, somebody was arrested in the airport for sedition for wearing a T-shirt. So that's really the level kind of we're talking about here. And because of that fear, the fear of the unknown, the fear like of a Facebook post or a tweet or something else getting you jailed, I mean, I think people are just erring on the side of caution, right? And so much of the government's focus has been rewriting history, rewriting the narrative. And, because of that, I think, any sort of book, any sort of kind of version that seeks to like establish this is really what happened, I don't know, there's an inherent risk in that too.
What I'm just curious what the dangerous T-shirt said, you know?
I think it said that there was an allusion to, revolution and independence within the T-shirt, but it was a T-shirt at the end of the day, right? And there was a description of police rushing to the airport to apprehend him. It was kind of absurd.
So, Timothy and Shibani, both tell our viewers what it was like to cover this movement, to get to know some of its leaders, how to do it in a way that was safe for you. There was a lot of tear gas and potential danger in the streets for journalists. Certainly a lot of danger for the people you were talking to, who risked a lot to tell you their stories. Just give us a sense of what it was like to cover it.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, by the first few weeks, it was a bit of, I know this sounds strange, but there was kind of like a rhythm or a routine to things. The biggest protest kind of generally happened on Sunday. Some other protests would happen on Saturday. During the week there would maybe be small events or smaller protests at different places. But Sunday was really kind of like the big day of the week where we would go out and we would be, uh, following the rallies or the marches, and then later on, when the police tactics got really aggressive, and then the protesters kind of responded to that by getting more radical in their own actions. We would be out there when that was happening as well. And so yeah, I mean, it was towards the end, I think it did become a bit more challenging. Trying to be out there. There was a lot of tear gas, rubber bullets, kind of predicting where the police were going to be or where you'd be going. I think one of the biggest challenges was that the movement was really huge and really diffuse and kind of leaderless. So on any given day, there could be events happening all across Hong Kong. There was only two of us, often kind of working together. So picking spots, trying to predict where to be at the right time. We couldn't be everywhere all the time. So I think that was kind of one of the harder things, was just kind of mobility and getting around the city and trying to get to all the places where things were happening. And then maybe Shibani has her own reflections on it, although we were together for quite a bit of it.
Yeah, in terms of, also just like keeping people safe, I think one of the biggest things about the Hong Kong movement was that so many people we were speaking to were anonymous. One of the really interesting things on our book tour was having people come up to us and say, actually, you interviewed me in 2019, but you don't know, because we were anonymous, right? That was definitely a sort of challenge to kind of surmount, right? Especially, when you're writing for the Washington Post, like there is an expectation, right, that sometimes you should have named sources and they should be able to like tell you about their lives and their details. And I think that was really challenging, and you understood why, right? Because there was such a fear of China's reach, even when people had left, right? Even when these protesters and activists have left to the UK or the US, I mean, there's still so much of a fear of China's like long arm and transnational repression and what that could all mean for them. And I think, ultimately that's kind of why most of our book focuses on exiles rather than people still in Hong Kong, because of the inherent risk there that is obviously to a certain degree lessened, right, if people are outside.
So, Shibani and Timothy, my own recollection of that period is from a brief visit in September 2019, watching the protesters gather on Hennessy Road and the inevitable escalating confrontation. And I remember saying to a group of the protesters that I had a nagging fear that they were repeating something I'd seen covering the Arab Spring and the Arab world, but I have to say other democracy movements that are leaderless and gloriously idealistic, but come to unhappy ends. And I remember saying to these young democracy protesters, don't make the mistake of missing your chance to get the best deal that you can, because that's what happened in the Arab Spring, and everything was lost. The movement was crushed and destroyed. Do you think that has any validity, that the movement, because it lacked leaders, just wasn't in a position to make good tactical decisions, and in effect just kind of went over a cliff?
Well, I can start, and then I think Tim also has thoughts on this. But basically, I think when the protest movement kind of started like getting, sort of more like radical, right? I think there was a certain degree of fatalism within it, baked within it as well. Like, I'm not sure people were necessarily looking for a deal by sort of September, October, because so much violence had happened. They felt so sort of brutalized by the police, the faith in institutions had totally collapsed. I think, there was this idea that like if Hong Kong is gonna fall, if we're all gonna, be here suffering, we should make the city as a whole suffer, right? A lot of it had, the focus had sort of changed. What they were looking for was sanctions and international response. What they were looking for really was to change Hong Kong's international relations and international dynamics forever. And in a way, they kind of did pull that off. 4 years ago, this month, the then President Trump passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, right? And that set the pathway up for sanctions against key leaders, including, Carrie Lam, the current Chief Executive John Lee is sanctioned. I think that's kind of what so many people wanted to see, because they kind of felt like we're going to be like our future is hopeless anyway. We're all going to end up in jail anyway for doing this. We're all like putting our lives at risk. But still, I don't think people saw the extent of what was coming from Beijing.
Yeah, yeah, and I think to your broader point, we did when we went into this book. I think we wanted to keep looking at it as journalists and not as advocates, and keep reporting on it. And I think we did went we tried to point out in the book some of the uglier moments of the movement, and some of the tactical mistakes that the protesters certainly made. I think barricading themselves into Polytechnic University in November turned into a really a huge blunder on their part. There was a huge amount of violence, a huge amount of arrests, injuries, people in really dangerous situations. That was something that I think really looking back was not a smart idea. There was also some attacks on mainlanders or people perceived to be from the mainland. So certainly, I think we try to address those moments, in the book as well, and not look at this thing, totally kind of idealistically.
So in the few minutes that we have left, just a couple, I want to ask each of you briefly to stand back and explain for our viewers what you see as the lessons of this story that you covered, in terms of Taiwan, in terms of the Chinese people's obvious desire for more freedom, more democracy. What lessons do you draw? Shibani, you first.
Sure. I mean, I think that my main takeaway is how sort of fragile institutions are. I don't think anyone could have expected the speed and intensity of what would happen in Hong Kong. Like sitting in courts and sort of watching these essentially show trials today against people like Jimmy Lai, against the group of 47. I don't think anyone could have predicted that that would happen quite in the way, in sort of the sweeping nature it has, right? And for so long, if Hong Kong people trusted anything, it would be that their common law courts, it would be that their institutions like that would protect them. It would shield them, right, from whatever might come from Beijing. And I think we've learned that it's very fragile, and these things can change and sort of disappear very quickly in such a short span of time.
And Timothy, be specific about the lesson for Taiwan, which obviously is very much in our mind.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think a few things come out of this situation in Hong Kong that reverberate in Taiwan. The first being that Tsai Ing-wen was elected president there, using a lot of what had happened in Hong Kong, as part of her campaign, as part of her rhetoric. And through that, I think we saw that one country, two systems is not a acceptable way of governance for the people of Taiwan. I don't think in the near term or in the medium term or maybe even in the long term they would be willing to accept that type of setup, which, as Shibani mentioned, at the beginning was the original vision of one country, two systems when Deng dreamed it up. So I think those are certainly two things that come across. And then I think also in our reporting, we found, a lot of the rhetorical support that came from Hong Kong, from lawmakers, from the Trump and then also the Biden administration. There was also a lot of disappointment amongst people in Hong Kong. That immigration pathways weren't opened up for them to come to the United States. That the United States had been such a vocal backer. Some Republican lawmakers in particular even came to Hong Kong. That then they would be sort of, I think, felt like they were kind of forgotten about or used for domestic political gains within the United States. And I certainly think that there is reason to kind of interrogate the reason behind and the sort of validity of the people that are now, throwing themselves into into the Taiwan cause in the way that they are, U.S. lawmakers, kind of in particular.
So last quick question, and then we got to wrap it up. Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen said Wednesday that she thinks a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is not likely for the immediate future. Do you think she's right, Shibani?
Probably. Probably. I just don't see the incentive to sort of do it in that way. And I think, many people have predicted it would never be a full-blown sort of invasion, maybe blockade as a step towards that, right? I mean, I think that the sort of paradigm of using kind of even Ukraine, right, is pretty flawed when sort of applying it to Taiwan. But yeah.
Yeah.
So
No,
I
I mean,
want
I would.
to go ahead, Timothy.
No, I'm saying I would agree with what Shibani said.
So I want to thank you both. It's a wonderful book, a powerful story, an upsetting story to see the freedom of these Hong Kongers, Hong Kong citizens, crushed in the way that it was. I want to thank you both for joining us, and thank everybody for tuning in. We have lots more great Washington Post Live programming. Please go look for it, register for the programs that interest you, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us.